have the share screen ability? Yes, I do. Perfect. Okay. All right. Percent. Okay. Well, thank you for the meditation. I don't know about any of you, but I do find that online things like this, I feel a little bit more ungrounded and slightly less connected. So I'm hoping that that will ease as it continues. I think we're all still adjusting to this kind of weird format of not being in person. I also just want to acknowledge that, things are really weird, and astrology can be a great tool for understanding context. But I also don't want astrology to be a distraction, but rather a deepening. And my hope for this evening is to make retrogrades just feel a lot more friendly, and also not use astrology as a band-aid. I think that's something that I struggle with a lot, is that the more general astrology becomes, I think the more we tend to blame things on planets or make us think that planets are causing things. But actually, in my experience, it's like what the planets are doing they're showing us patterns that are already in our collective and personal psyches and in our consciousness. And so in this way, the planets aren't causing things to happen, but they're actually creating patterns that we can notice. And so I just want to be clear with that. There's also a lot of terrible things going on racially, people being killed. There's, extended shelter in place orders. So there's just a lot going on. And I want to just honor and acknowledge that this is not an easy time for anyone. And I do feel grateful to be sheltering in place in safety, but I know there are many who are not. All right. So I wanted to get that out of the way. I think it's helpful to just name what's going on collectively before we talk about astrology, because the two are so interwoven. Actually, is this being recorded, Melissa? I wasn't sure.
Yes,
it is. Perfect. Okay, thanks. All right, so who am I to talk about the stars? Well, I'm just a bit of an astro weirdo. I got really into astrology about 11 years ago, before I thought it was really dumb. I used to make fun of people who talked about, in fact, someone on this call is here, and I used to make fun of him for liking astrology from what I remember. But now it's what I do for a living. It's my full-time thing, and it's the weirdest job I've ever had. But a part of what I love about it is that it really gets to put us in this place of creating a relationship with the vast cosmos, right? It takes us from our world of human and our world of earth and helps us expand our awareness into far beyond what's happening right here. And so that's what I really love about it. So there's something a little different that with the astrology that I practice that I just want to name before we dive in. During my master's degree, I studied with a teacher and philosopher who basically tracked all of the planets and all the major historical contexts. His name is Richard Tarnas. And he found that certain, wars were more likely to happen during certain combinations. And financial collapses, like the one we just had, is actually a pattern that has been recurring for, hundreds of years that happens when similar planets do similar things. And so this sort of orienting around that pattern is called archetypal astrology. So again, it's less of a predictive modality and more of a pattern recognition modality. And so that's why the things that I say about charts or otherwise may feel a little different. It's definitely not like a WebMD style where you just kind of go online and there's the same information. I really want to, if nothing else, help you complexify your understanding of what's happening in the sky, but also just bring more of a deep appreciation for the fact that there are many things that we know and many things that we can't know at the same time. All right, so when I think of retrogrades, instead of being doom and gloom, I really see these cycles of opportunities to really choose free will over fear. So when we read something online, it's like, oh, this retrograde is happening, it's going to be terrible. To have this reminder that that may be the case, or there's hundreds of other ways that may manifest for us. So getting out of this mentality that retrogrades are bad, but that in fact, they're more of like timekeepers. There are phases where we get to kind of go back and do something over. Times where we get to revisit something that maybe we missed before. And in this way, they are actually my favorite part of astrology. I love retrogrades, even Mercury, all of them. I find that they give us such beautiful insight into things that I maybe forgot about. All right, so this is an image. I'm hoping, I don't see it. Or maybe it's not going to show up. I'll go back then. But it's this image of what a retrograde looks like. Because thousands of years ago, when humans were, trying to understand this vast relationship to the sky, there were these stars that seemed to move backwards, and they called them planets, which comes from the word for wandering star. And so what was happening in that moment is that they were looking up and they were tracking every day what was moving, and they noticed that certain stars would move backwards in the sky instead of forwards in the sky. And now we know that the reason why it was doing that is because those planets were in retrograde motion. And so what is a retrograde? Well, because of the orbit of Earth and the speed of our orbit, it creates things where when we look at planets that have different orbits than ours, depending on how fast or how slow they are, they're going to seem to move backwards. But of course, this is an illusion. I think, as many of you know, the planet is not actually moving backwards. So in this way, retrogrades are a lot more symbolic, because it's this idea that we're moving backwards. It's a perception, but that's not actually what's happening. It's all from our lens from planet Earth. So because of this orbiting structure, where our orbit is faster than, say, Saturn, that's why Saturn moves so much slower. And that's why the retrograde is so much longer. And we'll get into more of this a little later on. But that's why Mercury retrogrades so often, is because its orbit speed is closer to ours. But this orbit speed is also why the moon will never be in retrograde and the sun will never be in retrograde. So those are the two things that never retrograde in our sky. So if we're looking at the skies, those are the things where the placement that we can predict, they will never move backwards. That's because, the moon is in Earth's orbit and we're in the solar orbit. I think bringing in a little bit of that kind of astronomical context is a fun way to really understand that astrology was created by humans, right? It is our imprint onto the sky. And so in that way, it's also, I think, we evolve with astrology. Anything else I want to say about that? I think that's it around what a retrograde actually is and isn't. I want to talk briefly about what are the phases of a retrograde. And again, if your astrological knowledge is not fairly extent, that is fine. Take what resonates, kind of leave the rest. This is not meant to be like where you walk away and you're going to completely understand everything. Astrology is a language, and sometimes it's a language that's easy to understand, and sometimes it can feel really complex and difficult. So take and leave whatever makes sense to you. All right, so that being said, so the phases of retrograde. So we have this, we're looking up at the sky, and there's this star that seems to look like it's moving backwards. Well, what are these phases of its backward motion? Well, so there's 5 technical phases of a retrograde. So there's a pre-shadow, a station retrograde, the actual retrograde, the direct station, the post-shadow. So when you see people talking about retrogrades online, they're often say, okay, well, Saturn station's retrograde today. And so what they're meaning is they're speaking to this phase, which means that this is a moment when a planet stands still before it moves backwards. So I'll just kind of go in order. So the pre-shadow is kind of complex, but it just basically means what is the phase where the planet is going to go back to that as it retrogrades. So it's like if a planet's starting here, and then it keeps moving, and then it retrogrades and it goes back. Where it retrogrades back to is called the pre-shadow. So some people really focus on the shadow phases. Some people focus on the retrograde phases. It really just depends on the person. I feel like I should educate people on the shadow phases, but I often don't feel them that much. I tend to really feel the retrograde much more than what are called shadows or pre-shadows. But just to give you context so that you do see that information online, that's what they're talking about. So the station retrograde is where it's this magical moment where the planet seems to kind of suspend in time, where it like pauses before it shifts motion backwards. And so it's stationing, it's standing still. And then there's the retrograde phase where, depending on the planet, it'll move a certain number of degrees backwards or forwards. Backwards because it's retrograde. And then the direct station is the moment again where it pauses and then moves forward again. And then the post-shadow is this phase again where it was before it went retrograde. So for those of us who are studying astrology, the retrograde phases are something that are happening all the time. I mean, at any given moment, there's probably 100,000 asteroids retrograding. There's dwarf planets retrograding. It's helpful to know that retrograde cycles are happening constantly. And so there's certain cycles that we obviously pay more attention to because they're planets that we're more familiar with. But that doesn't mean that these cycles aren't occurring all the time just because we aren't paying attention to it. So I think that's important to note, that retrogrades don't necessarily have to feel really dramatic, because in actuality, they're happening all the time. It's kind of our varying degrees of attention that I think can sometimes make it feel like it's more important, depending on the planet that's happening too. So the next kind of aspect of a retrograde is, I just want to briefly talk about what's happening in May, and then we're going to talk about what to do when there's a retrograde, like how to look at your chart, what sorts of things to pay attention to, and that's really where it's going to get juicy. And then we'll leave time for questions. So I'm not going to spend too much time on exactly what's happening, because in astrology, knowing your personal chart and kind of finding ways to ground it, I find more helpful. Astrology can get very abstract, and I don't want to take us really far out without really bringing us down into what to do with the information. So here are the four. There's three planets and one asteroid going retrograde in May. Not every astrologer is as into the asteroids as I am, and so that's just something to note, that you may not see people post online or hear a lot about the asteroid retrogrades. But the reason why I post them is that depending on someone's chart, that asteroid may be really prominent, and so knowing about that retrograde may be really important, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But the first major retrograde that kind of swooped in May happened on Mother's Day, and that was Saturn. And that's going to be it spends almost half the year in retrograde. So most people actually a lot of people are born when Saturn is in retrograde. It's fairly common because that planet moves backwards quite a bit of time throughout a year. So the structures and kind of the themes that would go on during a Saturn retrograde phase are often related to commitment, discipline, legacy, structure, boundaries, constriction. So interesting that the conversations around possibly extending shelter in place happened as Saturn was going retrograde, right? This planet of constriction and confinement started to go backwards around the same time. There's talk, especially in California where I am, around possibly extending the shelter in place. So that would be an example where you could see it externally, where there's this real sense of something there's constriction. It might show up more personally as like learning about what you're really committed to, really trying to understand like where you're disciplined and where you're not. Although I would say I don't know that a pandemic is the right time to find your discipline. That's a little bit difficult at the moment. But really looking, what are the structures you want to put in place? What are you really committed to? What is your legacy? Those might all be personal themes that would come up during a Saturn retrograde, depending on your own chart. And also just depending how much those happen to be a part of your day-to-day thinking. The second big retrograde that's happening began today, which is why I was so excited when we were initially talking about collaborating, because Venus doesn't go into retrograde every year. It's about every 1.5 years. The retrogrades happen, I believe it's 5 times every 8 years. Venus will move backwards because it's closer to Earth. Its retrograde cycle happens less frequently because of its orbit speed. So Venus is only going to be in retrograde, I think it's about 40 some odd days, like 43 or so, 44 days. So the themes that, if you're seeing people talk about Venus retrograde online, some of the themes to think about are around connection, intimacy, pleasure, relationships. And I want to be clear that Venus is not concerned with just romantic relationships, right? Venus really it's all of our connections. It's our connection to family, our connection to place, our connection to earth, our connection to friends. But really it's also connection to ourselves and our value and our worth. And so those would be some kind of personal themes that might show up during a Venus retrograde. And then collective themes, I would look out for, like, what is valuable? What are the values that we share as a community or as a collective or as a humanity? Venus is all about what we value. Other themes would be around money. There's lots of structure shifting around the economy, but Venus is also about how do we earn money? How do we earn our value in society? So those might be some of the themes we could see. Also, just a concern around relationships in general. Like, are we feeling connected to people? Where do we feel lonely? Those would be major things that Venus kind of brings to the surface as it's moving backwards. The third major retrograde happens tomorrow, and that's Jupiter. And I do want to say that I think that Jupiter gets let off the hook a lot. I think people tend to think of it as this jovial, lighthearted planet, and I think that's true. But just like Saturn has a positive side, even though it's often thought of as a heavy planet, Jupiter also has a shadow side. And so I see something to look out for collectively and personally around Jupiter themes would be like a righteousness around morality, or these ideals that the idea of who knows truth is a big question with Jupiter. And I feel like we're seeing that a lot, right? Like, where is truth coming from? Who knows the truth? Instead of the complexity of truth that is multidimensional and multifaceted. That's kind of what I feel like Jupiter maybe is balancing out in our collective psyches right now, is who decides what's true, and what is the relationship to not telling the truth at all, and challenging the truth in others. Those are kind of questions that Jupiter brings up. It's also connected to religion and kind of religious righteousness, or that morality fits a certain way and everyone else is kind of wrong. I spelled abundance wrong. That's also in there. And vision. I think the positive side thing about Jupiter is also this collective vision and this optimism. Like, where are we heading as a collective? And in June, there's going to be a major planetary thing going on with Pluto and Jupiter. And at that time, I think we're really going to start to see like a real, even more of this kind of shadowy nature of like, what do we bring to the surface to really create a new vision, which I think is what all of us are wanting and feeling, and maybe not sure what that's going to look like. And so my hope is that as Jupiter goes into retrograde, and also as it comes out of it, that this collective vision will maybe become more clear, and that the ideals can align more congruently together. And then the last retrograde happening in May is with one of my favorite asteroids, Pallas Athene. And this is an asteroid that really is about the intellect and intuition, but it really focuses also on just what is wisdom, right? Like, what is this process where we know something both intuitively and intellectually? It's paradox. It's when we're learning and teaching. It's curiosity. And an example that I'll give as we're kind of talking about some other parts of retrograde is that with Pallas, like I've already kind of decided, Pallas is also craft. And so I would be really interested to see what happens during this retrograde around people's craft, like what hobbies, what new learning shows up during that retrograde that goes until September. All right, so those are just some of the things happening in May. I want to go into kind of then how to work with that. And I wonder if there's any questions from this point before we kind of dive into like, okay, what do we do with knowing that these retrogrades are happening? I haven't seen the chat. Let me see if there's any.
Doesn't look like there's many in the chat.
Okay.
People are staying quiet and just listening. But if anyone has a question, you can go ahead and ask. We can take 2 or 3.
And Miranda, yes. Miranda, yes, there will be, the recording will be sent up with a follow-up email as well. So yes, thanks for asking. And let's see, can you share a little more about Pallas? Yeah, Janet, so I'm going to talk more specifically about some of the other archetypes as we go through. We're going to kind of do an exercise around preparing, but yeah, Pallas is a little bit lesser known archetype in the solar system. She's one of the, I don't want to say she because I don't want to gender the planets, but her archetype, her mythology centers around Athena, who is the goddess of wisdom. And so a lot of what she represents in our psyche is, oh, Rachel, yes, well, I'll talk about that on the next slide. Thanks for asking. Pallas really orients us to how we think, and to me, she really bridges paradox in her mythology. She's born out of Zeus's head, so I'm actually writing an article about this for Astrology.com right now, so she's very much on my mind. But I found in charts, she really helps balance people's curiosity. Mercury tends to be more linear thinking. Mercury in our chart is like, okay, I need to plan, I need to make a to-do list. Pallas tends to be more of the intellect that's more big picture thinking. It's more philosophical. It's more curiosity versus knowing. It's more philosophical, holding multiple truths versus just like one way of thinking. So in that way, it's like black and white thinking. It's like good or bad. But the beautiful side of Pallas would be actually where we are holding paradox, where we're able to see that something is both true and false. Someone can be both nice and mean, that we are both smart and dumb, all that. I hope that's helpful. I also can send some resources and have some on my website as well. I think this Pallas is such an interesting asteroid. Thanks for asking about her. Okay, so this is really the meat of what I want to talk about with everyone. I want to make sure I leave time for questions. So what I'll do is I'll go through my process of preparing for retrogrades, and then I'm going to lead us in more of like a kind of doing it together. We don't have to share only if you want to, but kind of going through these steps and showing you what they would look like. So you can do it either for any of the retrogrades happening. You could do it. I'll let you choose between like Venus or Jupiter or Pallas if you decide, just to kind of give you a sense of where we're heading. So this is what I think about, and you could do this for any retrograde. But the first thing I think about is, what is this planet or asteroid doing in my chart? And so what I'm looking at is I'm looking at specifically, so let's say an example, Venus. So I would look in my chart and I would say, okay, well, Venus rules Taurus. Okay, well, I'm a Taurus sun. So there's a chance that this retrograde may feel really connected to me. Venus in my chart is in Aries, so I don't know that that position would be as much of an impact. And I also look a lot at retrograde. Something I find that gets missed a lot when people are looking at their chart is this planet moving backwards than when you were born? Because if it is, it actually is going to maybe feel more familiar when it's retrograding for everyone. So a perfect example is Mercury. It drives me nuts when people really talk about how terrible Mercury retrograde is, because for a lot of people, they're born with Mercury in retrograde. You know, it retrogrades 3 times a year for 3 weeks. So there's a chance someone's going to be born with Mercury in retrograde. So when this phase is happening, I've had clients and they actually tend to really enjoy Mercury retrograde because their mind feels more kind of at ease. It's like it's familiar. It's a familiar placement, so it feels better to them. So knowing if a planet is in retrograde in your chart is really important. And you would be able to see that by, if you're looking it up online in one of the free programs, it would be the degree and like I think the symbol would be in red. I don't know, depending on what your program you're using, but looking for that red number would tell you if that planet was moving backwards or that asteroid was moving backwards. So the last and another really important thing when you're looking at your chart and kind of trying to understand, like, is this retrograde? Can it impact me, and how much? A big part of what differentiates archetypal astrology that I practice from other lineages is that we pay so much attention to the aspects of a chart. So in this way, let's say that your sun is in Capricorn, but it's opposite the planet Uranus. We would spend a lot of time talking about not the fact that it's in Capricorn, but it's opposite Uranus. And so the aspects are the relationships between the planets and the asteroids in your chart. And so when I'm thinking about, okay, so it's a Venus retrograde, I would be thinking, okay, well, what is Venus in aspect to in my chart? What is it in relationship to? Well, it's next to my moon. So that would tell me that there's something perhaps around my emotional field that might feel really disrupted around a Venus retrograde. But if all of this, if you don't know your chart that well, the next section is actually still, and the third section is still really helpful, even if you don't know your chart that well. I think where it can get tricky is that having an interpreter for your chart can be hard sometimes, especially if you're just poking online. So I will put my email at the end, and if there are specific questions about something in your chart, you're like, hey, I can't tell if this is an aspect, or is this an aspect? Feel free to send me questions. I have my email at the end, because that translation between looking at something online and knowing how it impacts you personally, I think can get where people get really lost in astrology sometimes. Okay, so that was this the first phase. Like, what is this planet or asteroid doing in my chart? So the second part is where it also gets really fun, because these planets and asteroids are named after mythologies most of the time. And so the archetypes, or what they represent to us, both personally and collectively, are often based on myth. And so when a part of learning astrology, I find, is also really studying some of the myths that these planets and asteroids were named after. Granted, these are very Western thinking, very white culture with the mythologies, but there are actually quite a few asteroids and dwarf planets named after indigenous goddesses. And so even knowing those archetypes and reading, if you get there, is really fun. But just reading a myth about, okay, well, Venus is in retrograde. Well, Venus was birthed out of the ocean after, Jupiter was castrated. Like, that's interesting. And kind of sitting with, like, what are the parts of this story and this myth that are curious to me? Or maybe your dreams will start to have parts of that myth that you were reading about. And so there's kind of these threads you can start to follow to really feel how that planet has a relationship to you. Another part is just research. I tend to recommend that if you're interested in astrology, following 4 or 5 different astrologers can be really helpful to really get the different lenses, right? Because anything I say about these planets, anything I say at all about astrology is, of course, only from my own lens. It's from my own chart. And so reading someone else's may help spark something that maybe wasn't there for you before, or you didn't understand before, but then made more sense from someone else. So I really encourage people to do your research. Follow a few astrologers, read several astrologers to kind of get your hands in as many things as possible, see what resonates for you. The last piece of kind of exploring a planet or an archetype is really thinking about a spectrum, right? Just like gender, just like sexuality, planets have a spectrum. There's one side of the spectrum, in this case, tends to be more of like a difficult quality, and then one tends to be more of like its elevated quality. So in astrology, people tend to really focus on one or the other, right? They're like, oh, Geminis are bad, Scorpios are bad. But really, all of these planets and all the zodiac signs are operating on this big kind of rainbow of different experiences. And so an example, I'll take Venus again, because this planet's so much on my mind right now. A difficult side of Venus can actually be vanity, or like a materialism, or like a desire to just have things, or almost a superficiality. A beautiful side of Venus could be expressed through beauty and art and creativity, and the desire to feel connected and be relational and value relationship. So that planet itself, even though it's thought of as like a really nice planet, it also has these sides that may not be so pretty. And so that's another thing to think about when you're looking at these planets, is when you're doing research, is looking at, how can I see the whole spectrum of this planet or asteroid? So I want to bring this point, and then we'll kind of go to some questions, and we'll dive into a quick practice. Okay, and then my favorite part is actually this third part. And this is where we really bring it down to earth. So you've seen what might be happening with this planet in your chart. You're curious about mythology. Maybe you're having dreams about something that you read in the myth. Maybe your mind is having so much fun researching it. This is really where it gets fun, because you have to think about, how can you ritualize this experience? And so I ritualize the retrogrades, the day that they start and the day that they end. Some people might want to start it, some people may ritualize it halfway through. Maybe for others, the shadow phases are something they feel connected to, and so they want to ritualize those. But the rituals can include anything. I put them in my calendar. I look up and I put the dates of when the planet or asteroid is in retrograde. I put that in my calendar so that I can see visually, like, oh, bringing awareness to the fact, okay, this planet is moving backwards today. Interesting. First, I also have like an altar. So I'll, light a candle on the day that's going retrograde, or I'll read a book, or I often watch a movie related to, right now I feel like I watch way too many movies, but I will watch a movie or some sort of entertainment related to that planet. Also journaling. Projects are another fun way to orient to retrogrades. I tend to post this on my Instagram feed, but during retrogrades, I'll often make a list of kind of different projects that would be related to a planet. So an example would be Pallas Athene. I'm really excited during that retrograde because it's about craft and hobby. And so I'm learning about how to make baskets with pine needles from my area. And then I'm going to try like other craft projects around like cross stitching, or just finding interesting projects that may awaken something new and learn something new related to what this planet kind of represents. You know, for Venus, a fun project could be like going through old photos and putting up photos of people that you feel connected to. You know, a Saturn project could be literally writing out your 10-year plan, or really sitting down and orienting to what you're committed to. A Jupiter project could be rereading like a philosophy book, or even rereading the Bible or something that's meaningful to you, the Talmud, connecting to something religious or spiritual in that way. So the project piece and the ritual piece of retrogrades are really where I feel like things light up. Because it's creating a personal relationship to a planet versus it just being this thing that's out there. It's really taking it and bringing it here. Okay, so before we kind of go into, I'm going to lead us through an example of this for us to kind of just do it together. I want to look at the chat and just see if there's any questions before we move on.
Yeah, there's a couple questions. One from Faith. What site do you like for lay people to look up their chart, especially if we want to see asteroids?
Okay, oh, I see them. Okay, so looking up the chart, I recommend astro.com. And for that asteroid specifically, there's a section where it's called extended chart selection, and that's where you would insert the asteroids. I have a really nice fancy app where I've programmed it to the asteroids that I like, but if you're doing it free online, that site does the best job of allowing you to insert the asteroids. So I recommend that. Yeah, Janet, thanks. I think the spectrum is really important of the planets. And then the Chinese animal sign. So this is very separate from the Chinese zodiac. So there's actually not really a relationship. You may find one, or there may be an aspect of a rat that resonates for you here, but this is just unfortunately a very Western version of astrology. So it's not tracked by, it doesn't even have the same zodiac as the Chinese animal signs. And so connected to the one in 2018. So I believe this is in Gemini. So I think this is the last time Venus was retrograde in Gemini. It was actually 2012. But I tend to think that all retrogrades are linked, especially depending on your chart. So it could be linked for you. I mean, there could be a transit that you were having then that you may be having now. But last time Venus was doing retrograde, that's really not a technical term. It's not doing a retrograde. Don't say that to people. You're going to sound as silly as I just did. But there is, they usually, with astrology, we tend to track relationship through when it was going through the same sign. And I believe 2012 was the last time it was in Gemini, but I could be wrong. Okay. Any other questions? We're going to do an example of kind of going through this process, and then we'll just finish up with some questions. So, okay, so I'd love for you to pick a retrograde that's coming up. So you could either pick Venus, you could pick Jupiter, you could pick Pallas, whatever one you've heard. So we can just do this in our minds if you don't have a paper or anything. Chat. Okay. So pick a retrograde, and if you don't know what that planet is doing in your chart, that's fine, but maybe just make a mental note to, when you have better access to your chart, to look at what that planet is touching in your chart, what aspects, to notice if it's in retrograde, or notice what that planet is doing in terms of rulership. Maybe you chose Jupiter and your sun is in Sagittarius. Even just those sorts of meandering. So just really sitting with like curiosity around what this planet has a relationship to in your chart. So if you don't have your chart, we'll just that. So the second piece, I'd love to just take a few minutes and kind of sit with whatever planet you chose. What are keywords that come to mind when you think of that planet? So if you chose Venus, well, keywords could be love, connection, relationships, money, value, just kind of sitting with like, what are some of the words you associate with that planet? I used to do this thing where I would literally write down on one side, like shadow sides, positive sides. You don't even have to go that far, but you could even just make like a mental list of the words that you think of. And then thinking about, well, what are the things you've been told about that planet that are really great? And what are the things you've been told that are bad? So for the Saturn retrograde, maybe you've been told with Saturn that it's judgmental, or it's unkind, or it's distancing and cold, because that's what you've read about Capricorns. Or just kind of sitting with like, what are the things I've been told that are bad, and what are the things that are good about that, and kind of finding your way to the in-between of where those extremes exist, and knowing that there's all these other things going on between those extremes. Just taking a moment to kind of sit with like, what are those expressions in the world, and what are the words that come to mind? We'll just take another few seconds. And then to this last part of like, how can you bring that planet down to earth for you? So whatever words came to mind, perhaps an action comes to mind as well. You know, a common project for Venus, making more art, expressing more creativity, getting better about balancing a budget could be both like a Saturn and a Venus thing to be doing. Maybe you want to actually create an altar in your home for astrology, or for the asteroids, or for the planet, so that you can honor a planet as it's moving backwards. Maybe you want to draw that planet on the day it goes retrograde. But yeah, just kind of, I put drawing, and I'm like, there's no way I would draw a planet. I'm terrible at drawing. But just putting out ideas of kind of ways to ground a planetary energy. Okay, so this is kind of my 3-step process. Obviously, there's a whole bunch of other things kind of in this, especially if you don't know your chart. But I do find that this is just kind of an interesting way, so that when we see information about retrogrades online, we can really kind of discern like, okay, well, this person is having this experience of this planet. I wonder what my experience may be, and kind of doing your own ritual and your own process of reflection around what that may look like for you. Okay, so the last thing is just, here is my website, my email, my Instagram. I'm also offering a discount for sessions, especially right now during retrograde season. You can use this code Grayback Club, and this will be in the follow-up email as well. And then if there's more information about astrology, or like, what books do you recommend, what tools, on the Learner tab of my site, I have a list of books, podcasts, websites that I really love that are based kind of in this same astrological lineage. Okay, so with that, I know I have a few moments left. I'm wondering if there's any other questions that come up as you're thinking about this. But I also want to encourage you that my email is out here. I don't want you to feel like just because you haven't had a session or we didn't meet, feel free to send me an email. I think it can be so helpful to have an interpreter with astrology. It's taken me like 11 years to just now feel like I kind of sort of get it. So don't be shy if you have a question, or if you want to send an email, if that feels more private. Okay. Where are Vedic astrology? Okay, retrogrades. That's a great question, Jana. So again, what's interesting about Vedic and Chinese is they actually use a different zodiac. So Western astrology uses what's called the tropical zodiac. Vedic uses what is called the sidereal zodiac. And so there are just two very different systems. And some people combine and kind of find ways to interweave both Vedic and Western astrology. Like they'll use the fixed stars or the cycles of Vedic astrology with the planetary or the zodiac of Western. I just kind of find that it's like they have different ways of getting almost to the same place, is the way I've found it, is that they have different ways, but they kind of seem to me to end up in similar places. But I'd encourage you, if you're more interested in Vedic, to follow a lot of Vedic astrologers and kind of compare and contrast what more of the Western. They were both Venus and Saturn. Saturn is not retrograde in Gemini. It's actually going to be retrograding into Capricorn. It's in Aquarius. So I don't know the last time that Saturn was retrograding in Gemini. yeah, I don't know that I could do that math off the top of my head. I just know that the last Venus cycle was definitely in 2012 when it was in Gemini retrograde. I hope that helps, Evie. Okay, I think if anyone else has any other questions, I know. Oh, Brooke, I almost missed Brooke. Does the house these plants in a chart matter? Okay, I'm glad someone asked about the houses. So my process with the houses is usually to say not to think much about the houses until you feel really comfortable with the aspects of the chart. So knowing what relationships are happening between the planets. And let's say that you know that your sun is conjunct Jupiter, trine Neptune, opposite Venus. If you know the aspects, then I'd say move on to the houses. But there's almost 30 house systems. And so to get really interested in a house system, it can be really helpful to orient to a retrograde by house. But I find sometimes it's like a layer of complexity that can just make things more complicated unless you feel really comfortable with your chart already. I love house systems, but I feel like it took me at least 5 years to even find a house system that I really liked. And for those of you who don't know, house systems are just the ways that we divide up space in the astrology chart, space and time in the chart. I hope that helps, Brooke. And I also know that you know your chart decently well. So obviously if the houses resonate for you, looking at the retrogrades, then go for it, of course.